There are lots of different changes happening in general practice. In this episode, we're going to update you everything that's been happening, including the spring budget, because it's had some impact on general practice, COVID testing in primary care, rebuilding Jeremy Hunt. That's right, we're rebuilding him, and as well, various other things, including immersive technology and a few of the little hints and tips that you will definitely want to see, including the portfolio GP. So let's get cracking as we tech enhance your primary care knowledge. Hey Andy, how are we doing today?
Yeah, good, thanks. Yeah, ready to go through some news and updates with you guys and those people watching. How are you?
Ticking along. And we've got an action-packed feature episode because we've got so much to cover in this one. So we're going to be going a little bit quicker than normal just to get all the content in there. And there is some interesting content to cover, particularly current affairs stuff that's been happening, as well as various changes around general practice that we definitely want people to be aware of, as well as the impact on newer stuff that may be really interesting for some of you out there. So we're going to crack on with that. First up, we've got the spring budget, which is probably the biggest thing that came out in the past few days and stuff. Tell us a little bit about it, Andy.
Yeah, so first of all, I'm not an economist, nor is Gandhi, so we can't go into too much detail about the kind of economic impact and so forth
And this is
of
definitely not financial advice. We would like to point that part out as well.
absolutely. But I think it's been interesting. I mean, you know that something is having an impact when you walk into the staff room and you find that your receptionists are talking about a topic. Normally they're not talking about sort of current affairs or politics.
Mhm,
When we're having those chats over lunch, but people were really keen to talk about the spring statement or the spring budget delivered by Rishi Sunak this week, and the receptionists were, they were talking about things like inflation and growth and government borrowing and changes to national insurance, which is the sorts of things they're not normally taking an
mhm,
interest in every year. So this budget is obviously important and going to have some impact. Uh, I guess some highlights. So Gandhi's just brought on screen. There's an article from the Guardian which we'll link to. There's all sorts of analysis across, the broad spectrum of the press. But just to give some of the highlights, I guess there's going to be less growth than predicted. I suppose
mhm,
we had another bout of a new strain of coronavirus, didn't we, coming into and out of Christmas, which means that previous predictions for the economy made in the autumn statement had to end up on the floor or in the bin. So less growth, 3.8% rather than 6%.
mhm.
Inflation is higher than expected, 7.4%. I think that's the highest level of inflation for 30 years, people are
Wow.
saying. There was some talk about whether they were going to follow through on the 1.25% national insurance rise,
Mhm.
and that has stayed. So those were some of the headline things there. Have people been talking about the budget at your practice, Gandhi?
I think what they've been talking about is that the end result of all of this stuff and the fact that many people are actually going to take a pay cut from April onwards because of the various different increases and changes and stuff. So, as you mentioned, there's a social care levy of 1.25% that's universal across the board, and then various other changes in terms of pensions and other impacts. And obviously, as you mentioned, inflation, the rising cost of general living just basically means the end result of what people are actually getting is difficult. And energy prices we know are just being crazy, absolutely bonkers. That 5p cut in fuel duty that we were given, I'm pretty sure by next week will probably be gone in terms of the price rises that we're seeing with petrol and diesel and stuff. So, and that obviously has an impact when you're visiting patients. When are we going to start
Yeah,
seeing people say that they won't come to the practice because they can't afford to travel to the practice? Um, it's going to
yeah,
be an
certainly
interesting time.
if this follows through to public transport costs
Hmm.
as well. And also people are talking about the 45p per mile reimbursement that people get when they're claiming their mileage for traveling
Hmm.
around, whether that's still appropriate given the increase in fuel costs as well. So quite wide-ranging implications. I guess the budget's quite interesting for what wasn't there as well. But before we have a little discussion around that, I suppose the Chancellor has tried to mitigate some of these problems that people are facing in terms of the cost of living. Whether they're enough, I mean, I think that's another debate.
Hmm.
But I suppose just notably, it looks like actually, so the forecast for government borrowing were lower than predicted. Just looking at the Guardian article, at least here. So that means he's perhaps got a little bit of dry powder for later in the year. So we might not have seen all of the mitigations that might be coming by the time we get through to Christmas next year to mitigate some of these cost of living increases. So that was just interesting. Yep, they've cut fuel duty by 5p. Um, How much of an impact that will have, I'm not sure, but they have tried that. The national insurance, so the national insurance rises stayed, but they changed the threshold at which people begin to pay it, and they increased that by £3,000 up to the sort of threshold for beginning paying income tax, so to about £12,500. So the interesting effect of that is that actually for some of those people who are on lower incomes,
Hmm.
actually some of those people can get an effective tax cut. If I'm right, again, I'm not an economist, but looking at the figures, it looks like some people might get a bit of a tax cut actually. So some of those people that work for us, particularly say part-time workers, in our reception admin teams who are on lower incomes, may get a little bit of a cut actually in their national insurance, in their overall national insurance and tax contributions. So that's interesting, and other people will be feeling that across the economy. The effect is quite
Hmm.
small, but it's there. And also, he sort of implied, or I think said he had the intention to cut income tax by 1 penny as well, from 20% to 19% in the autumn, which I think was interesting, or in the future, when circumstances permit. So those are things that were there to mitigate. Has he done enough? Do you think, Gandhi?
I think the reality is many people are going to find that in just a short period of time, with inflation doing what inflation seems to be doing over the past few weeks, is that it's just going to all be obliterated in terms of the end result to people. Um, but hey, like you said, we're not economists, we're not financial analyzers, we're just GPs trying to make an understanding and help our patients and help our staff and stuff. So it'll be interesting to see what happens, but I don't think it's enough personally.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, I suppose interestingly, so there isn't any new money for general practice,
mhm.
and I don't think there was any increase announced for the NHS. I mean, the NHS has fared better than other government departments in the last few years, and through the pandemic, and general practice has seen an increase in funding, particularly through the funding focused on PCNs. So they may say they've already done some things for general practice in the NHS, but there wasn't any new money announced in this spring statement for that, and there wasn't really any help for people on benefits as well, which is a large proportion of many of our patients, and actually a lot of people who are working and in receipt of tax credits and things like that. And there was um, no increase or support for those people. Uh, so yeah, so a little bit conspicuous in terms of what wasn't there as well.
Mhm.
I don't know about you, Gandhi, but I remember that period after 2028 and the financial crisis, I guess the austerity era, we would call it. And I remember having really difficult conversations.
2008.
Yeah, following 2008, but
Yeah.
in the years that followed,
Mm.
when there were things like the extra bedroom tax, and all of these sorts of
Mhm.
things, when people were really feeling the squeeze, and that placed an increased pressure on the practice, where I
Absolutely.
work. Just having those conversations and the sort of mental health issues that arose from the stress of
Mhm.
living with those sorts of financial pressures, and I'm really, really worried that we'll see a similar effect with inflation so
Yeah,
high, and people's
absolutely.
earnings and benefits and wages just not keeping pace. So I think that's going to be really problematic, and we'll have to see how that pans out. But something that we'll have to steel ourselves and be ready for.
Mhm. And not only that, the impact on patients having to make choices between their health and their wealth, in terms of do they pay for their prescriptions, which is often one that I don't know how often you face that challenge, but I have many patients where they won't get their medications, they're not compliant with them because they can't afford to buy them. Um, Key shout out to the prepayment certificate. It's a really good way for those who do pay for their prescriptions to make it cheaper. But in terms of, those are implications a lot of patients have. We're already hearing about people having to choose between heat and food, and thankfully we're heading towards summer, so hopefully that's less of an issue for some places. But it's going to be hard, and as you mentioned, the challenge for many patients, where do they turn to when they need that help and support? It's general practice, which is what it's there for. But when it's already overburdened and struggling, then do we need to think about new roles, new opportunities, new changes to help understand that workflow? Like, for
Mm.
example, the PCNs, which is probably our segue into the next topic, isn't it, Andy?
Absolutely. So, some just interesting, really, because in the role of sort of clinical director, one of the problems that we've faced, I think, is what we can't spend the ARS money on. So that's
Hmm.
meant in the first few years of primary care networks, whilst a lot of practices have been sort of saying, can we use the primary care network money to pay for another practice nurse? Can we use the primary care network money to pay for another a GP to work across the practices? And the answer to this point has generally been no, we
Mhm.
can't. The only significant funding coming through is the ARS, and that has to be spent on certain, prescribed roles. But that might be changing, I guess. There's more money coming through other sources, like the Impact and Investment Fund, for example. And some primary care networks are now choosing to employ GPs. Now, I just thought that was an
Mhm.
interesting development that had been picked up in Pulse Online and a few other places. Is this something that you guys are beginning to think about, Gandhi, or what do you think about it?
Absolutely. So we've been exploring the concept of an acute assessment service, and that may be supported by a GP clinician, along with other roles, to try and enhance the acute care that happens across our network. You could create an acute visiting service that's also, supported by a GP clinician. I've heard of concepts of roving GPs that can work across networks. Enhancing that chamber style model, across a network footprint. I think the important thing to remember is that the only reason why this is now potentially possible is, like you mentioned, a lot of the funding that networks had was very specific in terms of how you could use it. And a lot of that meant that you couldn't use it to pay for GPs or for practice nurses in particular. So the two key traditional roles in general practice. But the IIF fund allows you to do that. And this is the first year the IIF fund has been significant in terms of the amount that you get for it to allow that to happen. So last year, potentially, most networks were probably taking about 20 to 30,000 pounds from the IIF network payments and things, whereas this year that significantly increased and stuff. So therefore, there is potentially that latitude in terms of being able to look at these more traditional roles in general practice and enhance them, but probably use them in a way that's sensible and fair to both the practices, the patients across that network footprint and stuff.
Yeah, and I think the extended access funding coming under PCN control going forwards is a really um, big opportunity
Mhm,
to both potentially hire GPs, to work across the primary care network in those in network hours, those periods where we have to provide the extended access.
mhm,
So there'll be funding for GPs to sort of truly be employed doing PCN work in a way that they haven't before. And I think there may be some quite creative uses of that resource and that time and those appointments as well. So I think we're beginning, interestingly, to see a move to primary care networks. Definitely employing more GPs. So I think yes, that was an interesting development, really, and it's worth having a look at the article. We'll link to it in the show notes. There's a few
mhm.
examples of what some primary care networks are doing as they begin to employ GPs. So long
Absolutely.
time
And I think
coming,
if
but I
you
think
wanna
very
hear
welcome.
I think if you wanna hear more opportunities and examples and innovations of primary care networks, then absolutely join myself and Andy for our PCN Plus course that we're doing with Ben and Tara, which is almost full as well. So if you do wanna join us, you're gonna have to sign up fairly quickly because we're surprised that normally GPs are traditional being last minute people to sign up these kind of things. We're almost full. So if you do want to jump in and join us, absolutely do so. The link is down below. So that's bit.ly/PCN plus in capitals. And you'll be able to join myself, Andy, Tara, and Ben Gowland from the Primary General Practice podcast and Tara Humphries from Business Healthcare podcast as we kind of support PCN clinical directors, their teams and stuff in terms of how to manage primary care networks effectively and absolutely things I imagine like portfolio GPs, how to use your finances, you know, budgeting. It's been a real interesting one because obviously tax end of year is in the next week or so. That's been absolutely a key part of it. And all the various different roles, enhancements, and all that kind of stuff. We'll be covering all that with our course and stuff. So definitely, if you're interested, sign up because you might miss out otherwise. Hmm.
Mm. Yeah, it's obviously identified a great need for
Yeah.
really good quality education for PCN leaders there.
Mhm.
So really blown over by the response. And I guess there's a few people watching out there at the moment, so welcome, and we'd really appreciate comments. We had some fun bringing on the comments 2 weeks ago
Yeah.
into the show. So if anybody has any comments about conversations they've been having around spring statement and budgeting,
Mhm.
all around creative use of IIF funding, then it'd be
Mhm.
fantastic to kind of hear those examples, and we'll bring you into the
Absolutely.
conversation.
Especially if you
But
wanna comment on our next topic, which is a little bit interesting because it's a bit of a redemption story potentially, or a antagonist turning to a protagonist. And, if you're a manga fan like I am, are we seeing that significant shift? And you're probably thinking, "What on earth are these guys talking about?" Well, we're talking about rebuilding Jeremy Hunt. Do you wanna tell us
yeah,
about it, Andy?
Yeah, let's build him back better. So yeah, Jeremy Hunt has been saying some quite sensible things in his time as chair of the Health Select Committee. It's been really interesting because he's obviously the same person that he was when he was
Mhm.
health secretary. So to me, this speaks a little bit about perhaps the limitation of what people can do and can say when they are actually in the seat of being the minister for health compared to what they can do when they leave it, really.
Mhm.
So what's he been doing at the moment? So he's just been, he's been speaking at an event, and he's been saying some very sensible things. So he's been talking about continuity of care, essentially, and saying how he thinks it's really, really valuable, that he thinks it enhances care, that
Mhm.
continuity of care reduces hospital admissions. I think we know that this happens, and there is empirical evidence that continuity of care helps with these things. And this article does cite an interesting Norwegian study that sort of demonstrates that if people want to go a little bit deeper in. Um, he's been saying that he wishes he did more for continuity of care when he was health secretary in general
Mhm.
practice. He did do this named GP thing. I don't know if you remember, Gandhi.
Mhm.
He sort of said every patient. Now, was it over 75 or was it every single patient? I can't remember. I think it might have been the older
Mhm.
patients, or at least that came first.
It was
Will
the
have a name.
unplanned admission days was his baby, basically. So, yeah, like you say, named, GP for all patients over, I
I
think you're
think it
right,
was seven.
70,
I think it was
70,
75.
75, something like that.
Yeah.
But all patients should have a named GP, but definitively follow-up in particular, and contact after admissions, care home residents, that kind of stuff, high risk, high admission patients in particular. The top, it was classified as the most, the top 2% was the criteria and things. So yeah, that was Jeremy Hunt's big thing, and it was a massive element of general practice at the time because it was, they took out a lot of QOF funding to support that.
Yeah, well, he was quite sort of realistic about the impact it had, actually, because he said it probably, in effect, that general practice probably sent everyone a letter saying your name GP is this person, and then nothing really changed. Was his reflection on that, and he wished he'd done more to follow that through, because he's really behind continuity of care.
Yeah, well, I
Um,
never shied away from being critical of the unplanned admission des. I thought it was just basically a bureaucratic paperwork exercise because it didn't fix the underlying issues that prevent people from having a continuous GP, which was the workload implications, the workforce implications. It did absolutely nothing to help with that, and actually, in my view, made it worse because it was trying to just make everything a paperwork exercise to try and make that flow. I think there were definitely some patients that benefited from it and some practices that found it useful in certain parts. But on the whole, it was a bureaucratic exercise that unfortunately didn't do what it should have done, in my perspective. But at
and
least
yeah,
he's trying.
he's trying, and he's given us a soundbite though. So he sort of said, "I'm afraid we're moving towards the Uberization of general practice,
Mm,
where you see a different GP every time you contact NHS, just like you see a different Uber driver. That cannot be a good thing for safety and care." And I think that's probably absolutely right. It's quite a headline sort of grabbing way of expressing things.
mhm,
It's a good way to get things across with that kind of comparison and analogy there. Um, so it's interesting, and yeah, I always think, what's he up to? Because Jeremy Hunt's in an interesting position, isn't he? Because he's sort of out of favour with Tory leadership, I
mhm,
guess, and is sort of on the fringes and saying sensible things. And I do wonder if we've not seen the end of Jeremy Hunt, if there's a,
mhm,
a, a shift in those people controlling the Conservative Party, and some of this might be sort of posturing for a return potentially. But he's a politician, so he's going to do that. And for the moment,
mhm,
he's saying sensible things. I remember a tweet series he did probably a few months ago now, but he was effectively calling for more objective scrutiny of
mhm,
health spending plans and health sort of restructuring plans, which I think sounded really, really sensible. And I've often felt that the NHS could do with a little bit more independence, or have uh, uh, oversight of policy, some sort of organisation that gives oversight of policy that is separate from the government at large. A bit
mhm,
like we have the Office of National Statistics, which produces reliable independent statistics on which government policy is based. And we've got the Office
mhm.
of Budget Responsibility that gives an independent take on the impact of budgetary changes. Could we have the Office of NHS Policy Impact or something like that? And he was effectively calling for that kind of approach, which I think was very, very sensible
But
as
doesn't
well.
that kind of exist already in the King's Fund? Isn't that kind of the work that they sort of do? But obviously they're not mandated to do it. They do it in a sense altruistically to give support and information and stuff to understand the impact of things.
I think they're largely a think tank, aren't they?
Mhm.
And I don't know. There's lots of those. I mean, and some might say we have economic think tanks and
Mm,
budgetary think tanks, and lots of people produce statistics. But Office of Budget Responsibility and ONS are kind of created to be
true.
objective, and not be at the whims of donors, and not be at the whims of those people who work for them, and intrinsic biases.
Mm,
It's designed in such a way as to limit those. So, but
fair enough.
anyway, interesting guy. Yeah, so he's sort of rebuilding himself, really, and it's a shame
Yep.
he didn't make these sorts of noises when he was Secretary for Health. But there we
People are
go.
probably wondering why we're using the term rebuilding Jeremy Hunt. Well, this is also partly because he's aligned himself with one of the campaign groups, which is based from the BMA and the GPDF, which is called Rebuilding General Practice. So they are looking at a proper media campaign to tackle some of the challenges that general practice face, particularly in the media side of things. And as it says, rebuilding general practice, and he has aligned himself with this cause, which is really interesting given the fact that many would attribute the reason why we're in this workforce challenges is because of policies made under Jeremy Hunt's watch. So is
Hmm.
he looking for redemption? Is he looking for, as you say, political maneuvering? Is it just, he's realized the error of his ways? I
Yeah,
don't
is he,
know.
is he is he just trying to do the right thing? And to be honest, he's probably doing his job as chairman of the Health Select Committee
Hmm.
well. In making these statements and asking these awkward questions. But next topic. So,
Hmm.
yeah, have you been having difficulty getting hold of lateral flow tests, Gandhi, in practice? This is
A
something
little
people are
bit. I
talking
can't
about.
seem to find any. Every time I go on the website, it says that there's none available, and you have to try later. And then it says you can try and collect them from your pharmacy. But when I go to the pharmacy, they say they have none left. So it's not been easy. What about yourself, Andy?
Yeah, I mean we've got a bit of a supply at the practice. Don't come and steal them. Don't get any ideas out there. But so I think we've been quite proactive in kind of ordering in over time.
Hmm.
But it only takes a positive event and some people to need to test daily and so forth to burn through those supplies really, really quickly. So I
Hmm.
don't think we're in the clear. But it seems a lot of people are having difficulty obtaining lateral flow tests. The government website for ordering these has changed. I think there are some statements there giving priority to NHS staff and vulnerable people, but there's still no test there to order or get
Hmm.
hold of, basically. So placing GPs in a difficult position. Some reports of GPs, practices, healthcare professionals having to buy their own
Hmm.
lateral flow tests, which can get really, really expensive, particularly if you're going to continue testing twice a week,
Hmm.
beyond April. I don't believe we've had firm guidance about what we need to or should be doing. And
Yep.
please do check for official guidance. Don't go on my word on this.
Mm.
But I think it's unclear what the position is on healthcare workers testing twice weekly, and whether that goes forwards. But if it does, there's going to be a need for tests, and they don't appear to be there, and it can get expensive buying these for your staff.
Mhm.
As a general practice, and as GP partners. So it's going to be interesting going forwards. I'm not sure what the resolution is. I think we just need some clarity from government as to whether they're going to support and assist general practice and the NHS to continue to test, and
Mhm.
whether that's a priority and whether that's a requirement. It seems sensible. We're beginning to see a spike in cases again, and some people remain vulnerable, and we continue to see those vulnerable people. So I think it's
Mhm.
it's a difficult issue.
And it places, I think, particularly employers in a challenging situation because if the government mandates that NHS staff need to continue testing, but then there's no provision for those tests, and that's an additional expense on the practice. How does that impact, service provision from a staffing perspective? Does that mean that actually there's going to be less people around because they just can't afford to pay them?
Mm. So
Who's
yeah, so
testing?
Yeah, so if people are out there, let us know if you've got lateral flow tests as well. How
Mm.
you doing getting hold of them, and what your position's going to be going forwards on testing in practice after
Mhm.
the 1st of April. So two more technology based
Just before we get onto
articles
that,
now.
so we have
Oh,
had a
go on.
comment come through from Faustina Popdali. This is really useful. Thank you. So lovely. Thank you for that, Faustina.
Yeah,
Really
thanks,
appreciate it.
Faustina.
as we know from many people, we love the comments and definitely the questions as well. So feel free to add more stuff to the chat as we shift over and go into a little bit more crazy immersive stuff. Tell us about it, Andy.
Yeah, so I think it's nice to just introduce some of the technology stories back. We've been so COVID and policy focused,
Mhm.
for a long time, and some of these technologies are really quite exciting and quite positive. In a world where things can feel quite negative. So I just noticed a nice story on health technology newspaper HTN, friends of the podcast, um, about a VR training film that had been produced to let healthcare staff know what it's like to experience delirium.
Mhm.
And what I liked about this story was you can click through and you can look at the experience and experience it. I'll probably press play in a minute, and they appear to have done something sort of quite effective that makes a really good point. And it doesn't look like it's cost them a lot of money or that it was very sort of difficult or technical for them to do. But having looked at it and pop my VR headset on as well, because if you've got one of those Google Cardboards or the simple ones that you can pop your phone in,
Mhm.
you can actually view content like this on YouTube in a sort of limited kind of VR
Mhm.
experience, which is really, really good. But they put together something that's quite simple but effective, and I think it will help people understand what it's like to be delirious. Have you ever been delirious, Gandhi?
Not that I can remember. I've had anesthetics a couple of times, so I'm guessing at those points I may have been a little bit delirious when I was coming out of it. Um, but you don't tend to remember those, do you? So, yeah,
No, I
possibly.
remember. Yeah, I once had altitude sickness when I was at the top of Kilimanjaro, just mild, but I was delirious. And it's funny, you sort of I felt I was at work of all the places to be, and sort of dealing with things at work whilst also walking on a mountain. It's very, very weird. So
Multitasking even on top of Kilimanjaro there, Andy.
yeah, that's where my mind goes, back to work. Goodness me.
Mm,
So, North Staffordshire is the trust that have done this, and yeah, I'm just going to press play here because it's interesting.
let's make it
The
a bit
sounds
bigger
on my
to show.
headphones, so you probably can't hear the headphones, but you can turn you can turn your head when you're in there, and they basically this is a weird experience because it's coming through my headphones, but this lady is worried about what these people are doing to her, and they're doing all sorts of things with this sound and wheeling things that look like bodies coming past, covered in sheets because of her distorted perception. And then from
Mhm.
time to time it goes back to normal as well. So I'm going to stop that because it was really disorientating for me. Um, but I think it just shows the potential of these sorts of experiences, and they also follow up
Absolutely.
with a feature article just looking at how these sorts of technologies are being used and how they might potentially be used in the future. Any any reactions to that video, Gandhi?
I think, like you say, it's a really interesting perspective to offer, and there's that element of, many patients don't understand what their loved ones might be going through when they're going through these episodes, and it can sometimes feel a little disjointed and a little, separated from what that you may be feeling. So being able to experience that and understand it better, I think, is always a positive thing. Particularly for those carers who look after patients who may suffer from delirium whenever they become unwell and things. I think having that perspective will always be a positive experience, and also for clinicians as well to actually understand what it means to feel delirium. Because, like you say, it may not be an experience that clinicians themselves have, and then that can hopefully help you adjust to be more sensitive and aware of the impact that certain actions you may have on a patient who's suffering with delirium can be.
Mm. Yeah, and I can see experiences of different illnesses being
Mhm.
created as well. I think those that kind of are perceptual in nature, so
Mhm.
potentially dementia and other mental health illnesses are probably the first place to go. And as VR gets better, you can simulate all sorts of other types of illnesses and conditions to help, as you say, society and family understand, and
Mhm.
also staff and clinicians understand what it's like as well. Um, yeah, the sorts of other applications for this technology that they discuss in the article are those around sort of general mental wellness, really. So just
Mhm.
sort of supporting um, positive experiences. People who perhaps can't go to certain experiences or get out, they can be virtually present there or experience these things in a virtual environment. So just to generally promote and sustain wellness,
Mhm.
people talk about specific treatments for mental health disorders, sort of providing support for patients with anxiety. PTSD is always a popular one, and
Mhm.
phobias and so forth, because of the potential to safely give people the types of phobic experiences, and in a way where they're not directly exposed to the stimulus. So there's always been felt to be potential there. Um, a lot of work already done on pain management, actually, which is probably working on distraction
Mhm.
principles. In children having blood tests or medical procedures, but also in adults as well. So that's a really potential area. And then, of course, in health education as well. I remember
Yep.
years ago we went to the Doctorpreneurs conference, and it'd be interesting to see how these guys got on. But they were probably a little bit ahead of their time, and they were looking at doing sort of basic life support training within a very simple sort of VR
Mhm.
simulator, which I've always thought would be really good for those sort of scenario based
Mhm.
elements that often come at the very end of the mandatory training that we do.
Mhm.
I thought those would be great, particularly if you can have multiple people in the environment, so you can do a little team scenario, as we sometimes
Mhm.
end up doing at the practice when we're looking at our basic and intermediate life support scenarios.
Mhm.
So that's got a lot of promise as well. And then they talk about rehabilitation as well. So that's probably sort of guided courses or exposure, or teaching people how to use new equipment safely, or begin to have experiences that might be dangerous, getting up and navigating the world as part of rehabilitation, to do those safely. And they talk about example of learning to use a wheelchair safely, for example.
Mhm.
So those are the sorts of um, applications that they've covered in their article. It's an enjoyable read, but particularly having the Delerium experience with the headset on
Mhm.
is really good. Particularly if you put your headphones in, it's really disorientating.
It
I
can
don't know
be,
what.
yeah. I mean, I remember using a roller coaster VR experience on a headset, and I remember the point where it tips you over and you look down, and I even though I knew I was standing, even though I knew I was perfectly safe and not moving, it still gives you that disorientated feeling. So if something as simple as that, and it was very, Minecraft style blocky graphics. It was not, fully immersive in the kind of video elements and stuff. But this kind of experience, seeing it, hearing it, feeling, almost feeling it, yeah, I think it's a positive experience to help people understand a really challenging perspective sometimes, because it can, it can be really difficult and stuff. I
Yeah.
know Faustina's commented as well, so thank you for the comment. I did a simulator of dementia in a special cabin. Awful, but very informative experience. So
Mm.
definitely thank you for that comment. And yeah, if people want to check out the links and stuff, we'll put those into the show notes, and they should be up shortly after we finish this particular episode and stuff.
Yeah, and I think I know we did some filming with a VR camera years
Hmm.
ago, if you remember, Gandhi,
Yeah.
at an event, and I think we were just beginning to kind of understand how it might be used or be useful.
Hmm.
But the technology is cheap, and I think there's a lot of opportunity for medical students or people in training positions or people doing projects to quite easily produce this sort of content, similar to this one for different conditions and for different applications. So I think it's a promising area. I'd love to have a go myself as well. If we dig out that
Yeah.
camera, Gandhi, maybe have a go.
I think we could. Well, in fact, listen, that could be a future episode once me and Andy get back into the swing of things and stuff. So you guys can experience what it feels like to be in the podcast with us, or maybe even some other things. Yeah,
Oh my
the idea's
goodness, yeah,
already
that
coming.
yeah, that'd be interesting. Yeah, the mind runs with ideas once you start thinking. So, I mean, that's the end of the news. Really, those were just some things that caught our attention in the
Mhm.
news today. If you enjoyed those, let us know. Any comments, obviously, post those down below, or track us down on social media. We should be fairly easy to find,
Mhm.
and let us know. In particular, if you enjoyed us, looking at that technology area of immersive technologies, as it's called now,
Mhm.
let us know if there's other areas of technology that you'd like us to have a look at and explore, even experiment with equipment and so forth, and we'll have some fun and have a go and let you know what the outcomes are.
Absolutely. And if you want to check out another new area of kind of technology and that kind of stuff that you may not know a huge amount about, then definitely check out Andy's episode that he did last week talking about NFTs in primary care and the potential use and opportunity for them. And that's probably coming up right about here somewhere right now. And as always, EGP Learning is here to help save you and your patients time by taking hands in your primary care and learning. We will catch you in the next episode.